The snow had arrived early that year, and with it came the silence. A kind of silence that soaked into the bones of the pines and pooled in the hollows of the forest, thick as wool. Nora Delaney leaned against the old railing of her cabin's front porch, a cup of black coffee steaming in her hands. Her breath fogged the air, a soft cloud that matched the frost clinging to the corners of the wood. From here, the forest looked eternal, a vast ocean of dark green and white that didn't care for the comings or goings of the people who brushed against its edge. She hadn't seen another soul in 4 days. It suited her just fine. Nora had lived alone in the cabin for the better part of 2 decades, ever since she'd left behind the noise of Seattle and the broken promises of a marriage that had emptied itself of meaning long before the divorce papers were signed. She had traded concrete for timber, traffic for trail, voices for birdsong. And in return, the forest had offered her space to remember herself again. She watched a squirrel scurry across the clearing, too lean for the time of year, its coat mottled and dull. The wildlife was thinner now, maybe the early freeze had caught the smaller ones off guard. Maybe something else. Nora sipped the coffee and narrowed her eyes toward the tree line. Something was out there. She'd been catching signs for weeks. Scratch marks too high for coyotes, tufts of fur tangled in branches, and twice now she'd heard heavy footsteps on the gravel path behind her cabin. Not the rustling scurry of a deer or the playful gallop of a fox. These were deliberate, weighted, measured. A bear, she had thought at first. A big one. Maybe the same one that had knocked over her compost bin last spring and taken off with 6 eggs from the coop the summer before that. She'd seen its silhouette once at dusk, towering and slow, lumbering between the trees like a memory made real. But this time was different. This time it had come to her door. It was 2 nights ago, when the sky was moonless and the frost had crept into her window frames. She'd been in bed, half asleep beneath 3 wool blankets, when she heard it, a soft clunk, then the creak of the porch boards, then nothing. When she opened the door in the morning, something was gone, not food, not trash. Her lantern. The old oil lantern, brass-handled and dented, the one she used when the power cut out during storms. Gone. She searched the woods nearby, in case it had been knocked over and rolled down the hill. Nothing. No sign of it. Just prints in the thin layer of snow, not full paw prints, but scattered impressions, as if the weight of the creature had been oddly distributed. It didn't make sense. Not entirely. And that bothered her. She didn't like unsolved things. Not anymore. The world had taught her that unanswered questions were rarely harmless. So she started watching. She kept the fire low that night, sat with the lights off, wrapped in an old parka on the porch bench. The air bit her cheeks, but she didn't move. The stars wheeled slowly overhead. And then, close to midnight, it came again. No sound. Just presence. It moved through the clearing without noise, shadow slipping between branches. She saw it pass beneath the oak, the same one her husband had carved their initials into on their last visit before the divorce. For a moment, she thought it looked almost human in the way it stood. But the shoulders were too broad, the back arched, the head dipped too low. The bear. And it carried something. She couldn't see what it was. Just the glint of brass in the starlight. The lantern. Tucked carefully between its teeth. She didn't move. Didn't breathe. The bear walked past her cabin, toward the slope that dropped into the ravine. It paused near the trailhead, turned its head slightly as if listening, then continued on and disappeared into the woods. Why would a bear take a lantern? Why would it carry it so carefully? The questions swirled in her mind like ash on wind. The next day, she followed the trail. Not too far. Just far enough to satisfy the growing knot in her gut. The snow was light, the prints faint but traceable. They led her past the ravine, down toward the creek where the trees leaned close together and the light barely touched the ground. And there, at the edge of a hollow, she saw it. The lantern. Hung from a low branch with its handle looped around a forked twig. Beneath it, the ground had been disturbed, a wide circle of flattened grass and leaves, like something large had bedded down there. There were no bones. No scat. No signs of aggression or hunger. Just the lantern, hanging gently above the impression of a body at rest. She stood there for a long time, listening. But the woods gave her nothing. That night, she brought a second lantern to the porch and left it near the steps. By morning, it was gone. Nora wasn't sure what she was doing. She didn't believe in forest spirits or woodland magic. She didn't think bears had secret lives or rituals. But she couldn't ignore what she'd seen. And more than that, she couldn't ignore the feeling in her chest. Not fear. Not confusion. Longing. It was absurd. But real. She began leaving small items at the edge of the clearing. Not food. Never food, that was dangerous, and she knew better. Instead, she left things that had meaning, an old harmonica that belonged to her father, a bundle of dried lavender from the shelf above her sink, a folded page torn from her favorite novel. Each morning, the items vanished. Each night, the bear returned. Never to the porch again, but always nearby. Watching. Moving through the trees with a kind of solemn patience. As if waiting for something. As if keeping time. And then came the moment that changed everything. The night she saw what the bear had built. The first snowfall came early that year. Not in a furious storm, not with sharp winds or thunderous skies, but silently, almost politely, as though the mountains were exhaling. The flakes fell with a kind of tired grace, settling over pine branches, the curved backs of split logs, the worn path leading to the small wooden cabin tucked into a remote hollow of the forest. She had come here to be alone. Not in the dramatic way people sometimes claim solitude, but out of necessity. There had been too many voices in town, too many eyes asking questions she no longer wanted to answer. So she packed a single suitcase and drove west until the radio went quiet, until the roads turned to gravel and the trees thickened into cathedral walls. Her name was Mara. She was 56. And although she never used the word widow, it hung on her like the weight of a soaked coat. The cabin wasn't hers. It had belonged to a distant uncle she'd barely known, a man whose photographs showed more of trees than people. He had left it to her in a letter written years before his death, and she had only opened it once the hospital called her with her husband's final breath. The cabin was not beautiful. It was drafty and smelled of cedar and dust. But it did not ask anything of her. And in the months since she'd arrived, Mara had settled into a quiet routine that matched the forest's rhythm, rising with the sun, chopping wood with more effort than skill, brewing coffee over the old gas stove, and watching the trees as if they were waiting to speak. She was not looking for meaning. She was not trying to heal. She was simply surviving the long echo of absence. It was on the 5th day of snow that she saw the bear. Not at a distance, not through binoculars, but there, 20 feet from her porch, nosing around the half-frozen compost pile where she tossed apple cores and vegetable trimmings. It was a brown bear, not fully grown but large enough that her pulse rose sharply. She didn't move. didn't even shift her weight. The bear looked up, met her eyes for a second that lasted longer than it should have, then lumbered off without interest. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. 2 nights later, she found footprints in the snow, wide, circular paths marked with claws, leading up to the back steps. Nothing was taken. Nothing broken. Just the prints, like a calling card left under moonlight. By the following week, the bear returned. This time in the early morning, while the coffee was still heating. Mara watched from the window, breath fogging the glass. The bear did not go to the compost pile. It went to the cabin wall, pressed its nose to the logs, then turned as if listening. Then it left. She should have been afraid. But something about its presence, oddly, calmed her. She started to speak aloud, not to it, not really, but because she hadn't used her voice much in weeks. She told it about the squirrel that kept stealing from her woodpile, about the way the wind sounded different before snow. She said his name, her husband's, for the first time in months, and the sound startled even her. The bear didn't flinch. It simply listened, or pretended to. Then one day, it was gone. Days passed. Then weeks. No prints. No sounds. Only the memory of it, a silent watcher in the woods. But what she didn't know, what she wouldn't find out until spring, was that something had been taken. Not food, not trash, not anything left out for the wild. Something from inside. Not an object. Not quite. Something else. The rain arrived not with a roar, but a hush. The kind of hush that wraps around you, soaking into everything, soil, bark, bone. June had returned from the neighboring ridge, arms full of kindling, only to be greeted by the damp perfume of the oncoming storm. She looked up, eyes narrowing at the bruised sky above the pines. The light was faintly copper, filtered through thick clouds as if the sun were peering through smoke. By now, she could tell the difference between a short summer drizzle and a long, brooding downpour just by the smell of the wind. And this one promised to linger. As she shut the cabin door behind her, placing the kindling by the hearth, she paused at the window, eyes instinctively scanning the tree line. No bear today. No rustling. No paw prints in the damp earth. Just the sound of the forest bracing itself. That evening, June lit a single lamp and let it burn low. She had found herself doing that more often lately, keeping the nights soft, the cabin shadows alive. She didn't always want clarity. Sometimes, letting things blur at the edges helped her feel closer to him. To the old world, to the time before the silence. But silence had a different meaning now. After the bear's last visit, the one where she had taken the scarf, June hadn't seen her again for nearly 3 weeks. Long enough for doubt to creep in. Had the bear moved on? Had she taken that one item and simply disappeared into the folds of the forest? Yet June couldn't shake the feeling that the bear would be back. Not for food. Not even for the scarf. But because something had shifted between them, an understanding, perhaps. A tether. Outside, the rain began to fall in earnest, ticking gently against the window panes. June placed her hand on the glass and closed her eyes. Her dreams that night came thick with color, dark fur disappearing through trees, a trail of golden leaves that didn't belong to the season, the sound of low breathing in the dark. She woke before dawn, heart racing, and with the immediate, inexplicable conviction that the bear had returned. It wasn't logical. But the forest didn't always reward logic. It rewarded attention. When the sun finally broke through the storm clouds, it painted the forest with a strange clarity. Everything looked rinsed, raw. June pulled on her boots and coat and stepped outside, scanning the ground. At first, she saw only the usual, scattered pine needles, a crushed mushroom, the beginnings of a puddle. But then, near the edge of the tree line, a curved print in the soft mud. Then another. And beside them, something stranger still, a single white hair. She crouched down, plucked it carefully. It was coarse, long, and unmistakably not hers. But it wasn't from the brown bear either. A different animal? Or, she turned the hair in her fingers, had the bear shed something else? Something molting, transforming? That day, June couldn't focus. She burned her soup. She dropped a jar of dried herbs. She sat at the writing desk for hours without writing a single word. Her mind kept looping back to the forest, to the notion that something was happening just out of sight. By dusk, her restlessness overcame her. She packed a small satchel with apples, a bit of bread, and a thin red shawl. She didn't know why she grabbed the shawl. It had belonged to her mother, and she rarely wore it, but her fingers insisted. It felt symbolic somehow, even if she couldn't name why. June followed the bear's tracks as far as she could. They veered off the trail, winding through clusters of cedar and spruce, eventually vanishing in a bed of moss. The forest here was older, thicker. The air seemed to move differently, slower, like it respected the tree's long memories. And that's where she found the den. It was nestled into the base of a hollowed birch, partially concealed by stones and ferns. June hesitated. The smell hit her first, musky, earthy, but faint. Then came the sound, the softest whimper, almost like a sigh. Her breath caught. She stepped closer and crouched down. Inside, curled in a loose spiral, was the bear. Her eyes were half-lidded, glazed with fatigue. But that wasn't what stopped June's breath. It was the two cubs nestled beside her. Tiny, still wobbling in their movements, but alive, warm and breathing. The scarf was there, too. Draped loosely around one of the cubs, as if it were a blanket. The colors were faded, but unmistakable. For a long moment, June didn't move. She didn't speak. She just watched. The bear blinked at her, slow and heavy. There was no growl, no warning. Just an exhausted acknowledgement. A glance that said, "You see me. You understand." And she did. The scarf, the visits, the silence, it hadn't been about taking. It had been about trust. The bear had been preparing. Nesting. Choosing, somehow, a person who wouldn't betray her sanctuary. June set the red shawl down gently on a flat stone near the entrance, placed one apple beside it, and turned to leave. As she stepped away, she felt the weight of the forest shift behind her, not threatening, but watchful. That night, her dreams were clearer. She saw the cubs playing beneath moonlight, tumbling over each other in soft piles of fur. She saw the bear standing tall among the trees, her eyes not wild, but wise. She saw herself, younger, lighter, laughing as a child in a meadow with her father, chasing shadows. When she awoke, the forest outside was quiet. But it didn't feel empty. Over the following weeks, June resumed her routines. Chopping wood. Brewing tea. Writing in her journal. But now, she left small offerings by the tree line, apples, dried fish, a soft glove. Nothing valuable. Nothing to tempt greed. Just tokens. Sometimes they were gone by morning. Sometimes not. But she never forced contact again. She understood now that presence, not possession, was the language of the woods. One morning, she found the red shawl returned. It had been folded, clumsily but clearly, and placed on her porch. Its edges were damp, and a single pine cone rested on top, as if to keep it from blowing away. She picked it up with trembling hands. It smelled of soil, of fir, of something ancient and gentle. And tucked beneath it, nearly missed, was a stone. Flat, dark, and etched with 3 claw marks. Deliberate. Clean. Not natural? June sat down, the shawl in her lap, and cried for the first time in years. The storm that arrived that night was not just of wind and ice, it was one of memory. Eleanor sat on the old rocking chair by the window, its creaking a rhythmic protest against the howling wind outside. The bear had not returned for 3 days now, and that absence weighed on her more than the snow piling high against her door. In her lap lay the worn quilt her mother had stitched together decades ago, patches of cloth salvaged from shirts, curtains, a wedding dress. She traced the threads absent-mindedly, each piece a portal into the past. And somewhere deep inside her, an old feeling stirred, anticipation tinged with dread. When the knock came, not a real knock, but a dull, heavy thud against the back porch, she did not startle. She simply rose, lit the lantern, and opened the door with the slow deliberation of someone who already knew who stood outside. It wasn't the bear. It was Clara. Her niece stood there, soaked to the bone, her face blotchy and red from cold and tears. For a moment, neither said anything. Clara, not yet 30 but wearing sorrow like a threadbare shawl, seemed unsure if she was welcome. Eleanor took a single step forward, not toward her, but toward the storm. She extended her hand. "You came all this way without a call?" Clara nodded mutely, eyes brimming. And then she collapsed into Eleanor's arms like a crumbling wall, the storm shutting the door behind them. Later, they sat by the fire with mugs of tea and a silence that neither found awkward. Clara's bag lay untouched by the door, her boots leaving little puddles on the hardwood floor. Eleanor didn't press. She never had with Clara. The girl had always been a sealed book, ink still drying, pages fragile. But tonight, she offered a few pages. "He left," Clara said, staring into the fire. "Took everything but the silence." Eleanor said nothing. She only leaned back in her chair, the firelight flickering across her lined face. In the distance, something moved beyond the tree line. She knew who it was. But she remained still. "He said I was too much. Too quiet. Too strong. Too soft. I don't even know which of those is worse." Eleanor chuckled, a dry sound. "He left you because you weren't small enough for him." Clara looked over, startled. Then she smiled a little. "That's close to what it felt like. You'll grow bigger now. Not smaller." And with that, the night settled into a sort of understanding. Eleanor showed her to the spare room, the same one she'd offered Clara years ago after her mother died. Time moved strangely in cabins. The walls held memories like wine barrels held sweetness, deepening it over years. At midnight, Eleanor stepped onto the porch, wrapping herself tightly in a wool shawl. The wind had calmed, and flakes drifted like falling ash. At the edge of the trees, a shadow shifted. She didn't need to call him. The bear emerged slowly, as if not wanting to intrude. His coat glistened with frost, but his eyes were warm. And behind him, as Eleanor now suspected, were the cubs. Watching. Waiting. Learning. She crouched slowly and held out her hand. The bear came forward, not to her, but toward the edge of the porch, and there he sat. Silent. Present. The same way he had during the hardest winter of her life. I'm not alone this time, she whispered, almost like a confession. The bear rumbled softly, a sound between breath and growl. It was not sadness. It was something more ancient than language. He understood. Inside, Clara slept deeply for the first time in months. The walls held her grief gently, the way Eleanor had once held her as a child. Morning arrived with a brittle sun and a calm Eleanor hadn't known in years. She made pancakes, Clara's favorite, and as the young woman stumbled in, rubbing sleep from her eyes, she smiled at the scent. They ate slowly. Talked little. And yet, something in Clara had lightened. Around noon, they walked the tree line together. Clara, surprised, gasped when the bear appeared beside the stream, the cubs tumbling behind him like mischievous ghosts. "You never told me you had a friend," Clara said, half joking, half wary. "He visits," Eleanor replied. "Takes what he needs." "What does he take?" Eleanor's gaze softened. "Not food." Clara didn't ask further. She simply watched the bear, his large body still as the forest, his eyes locked onto something beyond her understanding. Over the next few days, something delicate unfurled between them, Eleanor, Clara, and the bear. There was no routine. No predictability. Only presence. Clara began to rise early, walk more, eat slowly. Eleanor watched without comment. The cabin seemed to breathe easier with her there. One afternoon, Clara placed a small, crumpled note beside the porch steps. Eleanor didn't read it. But the bear did. He approached it carefully, sniffed it, then sat beside it until the sun went down. And when the wind rose again, the note was gone. "I think he took it," Clara said that night. "He takes what he's meant to." But it was just paper. No. It was something you were ready to give. As the days melted into a quiet rhythm, Eleanor noticed something unexpected. The cubs had started leaving objects at the edge of the trees. A feather. A small stone. A piece of torn fabric. Not random things, but gifts. Offerings. Clara began keeping them in a wooden box by the window. She called it the bear box. And each time a new item appeared, she'd place it inside without question. It was a ritual without rules, meaning stitched together by intuition alone. Then came the day Eleanor had long dreaded. Her chest ached differently. Not the seasonal sting, but the slow constriction of something final. She told Clara it was just the cold. Clara didn't believe her, but she didn't argue either. That night, the bear arrived early. Alone. He stepped onto the porch for the first time, his breath fogging the cold air between them. Eleanor stood, not afraid, not even surprised. She looked into his eyes and knew he had come for something. But it wasn't her. He lowered his head, and with an almost imperceptible motion, dropped something at her feet. It was a piece of cloth. From her quilt. One patch she had never noticed was missing. Clara watched from the doorway, tears tracing her cheeks. She didn't speak. Eleanor crouched, picked up the fabric, and held it to her chest. Then she looked at the bear and whispered, "Thank you for remembering." The bear turned, padded silently down the steps, and vanished into the trees. Inside, the fire burned steady. And in that warmth, Eleanor felt not the end of something, but the continuation of a circle long in motion. The bear had taken something, yes. But in return, he had left them something else entirely. Memory. Connection. Peace. The sun barely crested over the horizon, bleeding amber through the trees. Clara sat on the porch of her cabin, her hand resting gently over the book she hadn't turned a page in for the past half-hour. She wasn't reading anymore, she was listening. Not just to the birds or the rustling trees, but to that quiet, specific stillness that hinted something more was out there. The kind of silence you learn to notice only after years in the woods. She was waiting, not out of habit, but because something felt unfinished. It had been 4 days since the bear had last visited. 4 days since it had stepped out of the trees, stared at her, and then, with the most peculiar gentleness, reached for the old wooden carving she had left on the stump. She hadn't meant to give it to the bear. Not really. It was something her late husband had made, the carving of a child holding a pine cone, worn smooth by time and her hands. Yet she had left it outside that night, absent-minded or perhaps unconsciously guided by instinct. And the bear had taken it. Not sniffed it, not pawed at it. Taken it. Carefully. Deliberately. Now it was gone, and she hadn't seen the bear since. Clara ran her fingers over the arms of her rocking chair, feeling each weather-worn groove. It wasn't just the absence of the bear that unsettled her. It was what it left in its wake, questions. And a kind of ache she didn't expect. She stood up finally, slipped on her boots, and stepped off the porch. A light layer of frost clung to the tall grass, crunching beneath her soles as she moved down the trail. Not toward the lake this time, or the stream beyond the pines, but into the northern grove. That's where the bear always came from, and if it had taken something, maybe it had left something too. The northern grove was denser than the rest of her land. Spruce and fir twisted over each other, and low shrubs clawed at her jeans. It had always been a place she avoided, too overgrown, too easy to get turned around. But today she pressed deeper, brushing branches aside and stepping carefully over patches of bramble. About 20 minutes in, the trees parted slightly, and she came upon a clearing she didn't remember from before. In the center stood a ring of stones, not natural, not random. They were arranged carefully, intentionally, like an altar or marker. And in the center of the ring, placed gently on a bed of moss, was the carving. Her carving. But it was different now. Flowers, mountain aster, goldenrod, and forget-me-nots were tucked around its base. Tufts of fur, maybe from the bear, were nestled beside it. And etched into the earth itself were claw marks. Not random scrapes, but a set of curved lines spiraling outward. It almost looked ceremonial. Clara knelt, her breath catching. This wasn't just a place the bear had passed through. This was a place it had made. A space it had claimed for something, someone. She touched the carving, and her fingers trembled. Was it mourning? Or honoring? Or simply remembering? She sat there for a long while, the wind combing through her hair, her eyes scanning the grove's edges for movement. But nothing came. The bear was not there. And yet, its presence pulsed in the clearing like an echo. When she finally returned to her cabin, the sky was dimming again. Dusk settled over the forest in heavy silence. Clara made tea, lit the lantern, and wrote everything down, every flower, every claw mark, every feeling. It was all too specific to forget, too strange to dismiss. That night, she dreamed of a den tucked into the mountainside, warm and dim. In the dream, the bear lay curled around something small. Not a cub. Not food. Something carved. Something wooden. And it wept. She awoke before dawn, her cheeks wet. Snow fell harder that morning. The forest, already hushed by winter's weight, became cloaked in an even deeper stillness, like nature had taken a breath and chosen not to exhale. Lydia woke slowly, warmth pooled beneath her quilt, but her eyes blinked open not because of the cold, but because of a sensation that she was being watched. The first thing she noticed was the window. Its frost-framed glass had been cleared, the center wiped in a perfect circle from the outside. No tracks in the snow. No sound. But the mark was fresh, as if someone or something had needed to see in. She rose without fear. Not anymore. Her bones stiffened less with each morning. It was as if the forest itself gave her purpose, tugging at the marrow of her soul. Slipping on boots and coat, she stepped outside, expecting footprints. None. Just trees. Silence. And yet, movement caught her eye near the base of the pines. A shape. The cub. Only one. It startled at her presence but didn't run. It stood there, hunched, paw raised, a slow, pained blink replacing the exuberant curiosity she'd come to know. Its ear was torn. Its coat matted. Something had gone wrong. Lydia lowered herself gently, boots crunching in place. "Where's your brother?" she whispered. The cub whimpered. Not like a dog or a cat, but in a way that seemed like a question, as if asking her to fix something it couldn't explain. She stepped forward. The cub backed away, but only a little. Then it turned, limping, and began leading her toward the trees. They walked, if one could call Lydia's careful steps and the cub's staggered hobble a walk, for over an hour. Through deeper snow. Past the eastern ridge. Into a hollow Lydia hadn't seen before, where a huge cedar had split in two from the weight of a storm. There, nestled beneath the fallen trunk, was the second cub. Still. She rushed forward. Oh, no. Its breathing was shallow. Ice crusted its nose. Its small chest barely moved. The other cub sat beside its brother or sister and let out a sound that seemed torn between a whine and a growl. Lydia removed her coat. Then her sweater. Her hands trembled, not from cold but urgency. She wrapped the motionless cub in her warmth and lifted it. Heavy, but not impossible. Its head lolled against her shoulder. "I can't promise anything," she whispered. "But I'm not leaving it here." The first cub followed close, never letting her stray far from its view. The fire was already lit by the time she burst back into the cabin. She hadn't remembered starting it. Couldn't have. But flames danced strong and ready. She lay the cub beside it, cocooned in quilts and breathless prayers. For hours, Lydia sat beside them both. The conscious cub refused to leave its sibling's side, nudging it, licking the fur, nestling close. Occasionally, it would glance up at her, like it knew she had more answers than she admitted. Then, by the grace of something neither woman nor beast could name, the second cub twitched. Just a little. Then again. Its nose wrinkled. A tiny paw rose and dropped. And the sibling squealed, a sound so joyous and sudden that Lydia's breath caught in her throat. "Alive. Don't thank me," she murmured. "Just don't stop fighting." That night, she couldn't sleep. Not from anxiety or fear, but from awe. She sat with them still, both cubs nestled by the hearth, their eyes reflecting the orange glow of the fire. She thought of people who'd left her behind. Of memories heavy as stones. Of grief that once filled her lungs like smoke. Then, she looked at those two small lives wrapped in her blankets, dependent, hopeful, wild. The bear hadn't taken food from her cabin. It hadn't taken anything, really. It had given her everything. Purpose. When dawn returned, the cubs stirred first. The injured one sat up, wobbly but alert. The other bounced excitedly, pawing at its sibling with reckless joy. Lydia laughed. "Your trouble," she said to the healthy one. "And you," she nodded at the recovering cub, "are a miracle." She knew they wouldn't stay forever. Bears were not meant for hearths and handmade quilts. They were not hers to keep. But something within her insisted they weren't just bears. They were a message. A tether. A story still unraveling. And in that moment, as the fire dimmed and sun spilled across her small cabin floor, Lydia began to understand something important. Sometimes what you think is lost isn't gone. It's just waiting for you to notice it's still there. By the following morning, the sick cub's condition had not worsened, but it hadn't improved either. Its breath still rasped in short, shallow pulls, and its limbs remained weak and unresponsive. The old woman had been up most of the night, moving back and forth from the hearth to the cub's side, brewing herbs she hadn't touched since the death of her husband. In silence, she crushed wild mint and goldenrod between her fingers, steeping them in water drawn from the well just outside. The healthy cub rarely left its sibling's side. At first, it had growled low at her whenever she approached, but slowly, as the hours passed and no harm came, its stance softened. By dawn, it allowed her to place a small bowl of goat's milk near them, which it sniffed and licked with nervous curiosity. By midday, the cub finally drank, barely a mouthful, but it was something. She watched from the rocking chair, a familiar ache in her knees and back reminding her of winters long past. In the stillness, she heard birds begin to sing again, faint chirps echoing off the icicles that clung to the roof. She sat still, remembering the last time the forest had fallen into such a hush. It had been nearly 20 years ago, during the worst storm she'd ever lived through. The snow came fast then too, wild and furious, trapping her and her husband for days with no way to signal for help. It was in that storm that she had lost the baby they'd been waiting on for so long, a grief so sharp it etched itself into the bones of the cabin. Now, in the quiet of this winter morning, another kind of helplessness sat across from her. The cub's labored breathing. The uncertainty of whether it would pull through. But unlike then, she wasn't alone. That mattered more than she expected. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, but the landscape was still wrapped in white. She knew the mother bear had not returned. She also knew, somehow, that she might not. The old woman took out the tin box of her late husband's old maps. He'd kept detailed sketches of the terrain, valleys, ridges, hibernation hollows. She traced one route with her finger, a narrow corridor along the old riverbed that the bears often used as a path toward higher ground. Maybe she took that route, she muttered to herself, not realizing she'd spoken aloud. The healthy cub looked up at the sound of her voice. It was no longer glaring or bristling with suspicion, just looking, as if trying to understand her. She smiled faintly and pulled a soft woolen blanket over her legs. Later that afternoon, the sick cub stirred slightly. Its eyes fluttered open for a brief second before falling shut again. The woman leaned in, a hopeful breath caught in her throat. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're not alone." The wind picked up again as evening came, brushing snow off the trees in gentle falls. The forest seemed to lean in with her, waiting. Winter deepened. The snow came heavier now, burying the world in white silence. Yet inside the cabin, life flickered steadily, like the flame in the old woman's hearth. The bear cub, though still weak, began to move more. It would shift its body slowly, stretching a paw, blinking up at the wooden beams overhead. The old woman fed it a mixture of warm goat's milk and crushed berries, just as she had once fed injured raccoons and fox kits when she was younger. The cub refused at first, wary and confused, but the other sibling nudged its nose toward the bowl until it lapped the mixture. Outside, the older bear, the mother, or at least the protector, never left the woods for long. She would come at dusk, sit at the edge of the clearing, and watch the window with a patience that felt almost human. Sometimes she left fresh-killed fish near the door, other times, pine boughs. The woman never saw her approach or retreat, only the prints in the snow told the tale. One stormy morning, while the wind moaned through the trees and the sky churned with dark clouds, the woman woke to find the stronger cub had left the cabin. Its prints led in wide circles around the structure and into the woods, not far, but far enough to understand what it was learning, the layout of the place, the sounds, the scent of the wind. It returned at dusk, covered in snow, and curled again near its sibling, as if the journey had exhausted more than its muscles, as if it had gathered stories from the woods and needed to whisper them back in quiet breath. The woman began talking aloud, not because she expected them to understand, but because it helped fill the silence, and perhaps, in some hidden part of her, she hoped they would listen. She told them stories about her childhood, her brother who had died in the same woods years ago, the husband who once built this cabin with his bare hands and carved their initials into the beam above the mantel. She recited old poems from memory, folk songs too, and sometimes, as she boiled tea, she'd hum lullabies forgotten by most of the world. And sometimes, when the wind wasn't howling, she could swear the cubs looked up at her, not with fear or curiosity, but with a kind of reverence, like listeners leaning into a fireside tale. Then one night, something strange happened. She woke not to silence, but to the sound of scratching. Not panicked clawing, but deliberate movement, cautious, scraping, almost careful. She sat up from her bed near the hearth and followed the sound with her lantern in hand. The sick cub had moved. It had dragged itself a foot or two toward the door, its body shivering. Its sibling was behind it, nuzzling, guiding. When the woman knelt beside them, they did not recoil. The weaker cub placed its paw on her lap and let out a soft, rumbling breath, not a growl, not a cry, just a sound of presence. She looked into its eyes, and in that moment, she did not see an animal. She saw pain, yes, and instinct, but she also saw something pleading. A need for something she couldn't name. Protection? Healing? Perhaps just acknowledgement. She sat there until morning, her hand on its fur, her breath fogging in the cool air. The next day, the cub did not move. Nor did it eat. She understood then, silently, without need for signs. It was close. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridge and the trees threw long shadows across the snow, the older bear returned. But this time, she did not stay at the edge. She came all the way to the porch. The woman watched from the window. No growl. No panic. Just slow steps, crunching snow. The great bear approached the door and sat. The woman opened it. For a long moment, neither moved. Snowflakes fell between them. Then the cub, the stronger one, stepped forward, brushing against her leg like a dog hesitant to leave home. The woman stepped aside. The great bear entered. The cub followed. They circled the weak one. The older bear sniffed it, then lay down beside it, massive body curled protectively around the smaller form. The woman backed away, slowly, silently. She returned to her bed near the fire and sat, watching. That night, she did not sleep. And when dawn came, only the older bear and the strong cub remained. The weaker cub was gone, not dead, she sensed, but taken. Somewhere deeper into the woods. Somewhere she could not go. But on the windowsill, left neatly, was something unexpected, her husband's old leather knife sheath. She hadn't seen it in years. She stepped outside, into the snow, and found no blood, no signs of struggle, only 4 sets of paw prints, leading east into the rising sun. The old woman hadn't slept all night. The floorboards of the cabin creaked under her as she paced slowly, firelight flickering off the walls. Every so often, she would look toward the corner of the cabin, where the small cub lay curled against an old wool blanket, its shallow breathing barely stirring the air. The mother bear sat just beyond the threshold now, her massive frame half in shadow, half illuminated by the faint glow of the fire. She made no move to step farther inside, nor did she retreat. Her dark eyes watched, not with suspicion but with something deeper, resignation, perhaps, or worry. The other cub, the stronger one, had fallen asleep with its head resting on its sibling's paw, unaware of the weight pressing on the room. The old woman knelt again, placing her hand gently on the sick cub's back. The fur was still warm, the breath still faint. But fading. "I've done all I can," she whispered. Not to the cub. Not even to herself. To the mother bear. A long silence passed. Then came a sound the woman hadn't expected, the creaking of ice outside, a groan from the forest as trees shifted slightly under the weight of snow. But more than that, the bear made a noise too, low, guttural, but not angry. Almost a hum. The kind of sound a mother might make beside a cradle. The woman reached for her kettle and poured a little more of the herbal mixture she'd prepared earlier, wild mint, willow bark, honey, into a bowl. She dipped a cloth in it and gently pressed it against the cub's side. "You're not going to die in the cold," she murmured. "Not while I still breathe." She didn't notice, but the mother bear had edged closer. Her nose was now inches from the wooden floor, her paw just inside the cabin. The heat from the fire licked at her fur. Still, she did not move farther. The old woman went about her tasks as if this were ordinary, tending to a sick cub, watched over by a full-grown bear. She retrieved an old flannel shirt, folded it into a makeshift pillow, and tucked it beneath the cub's head. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from fatigue. She hadn't eaten in nearly a day. At some point, her body gave in. She slumped against the wall, eyes fluttering closed. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the snow fell more gently now, blanketing the world in hush. She awoke with a jolt to the sound of shuffling. The cabin was brighter than before. Early morning light filtered through the frosted window. She looked to the corner, and the cub was gone. Her heart leapt. Then stopped. But then she noticed the trail of small paw prints leading to the door. The blanket still warm, the shirt crumpled. And on the threshold, standing silently, was the mother bear, one cub by her side, the other nestled against her massive leg, awake. The old woman pushed herself to her feet, heart racing. The sick cub, it was alive. Weak, but standing. Eyes open. The mother bear met her gaze, then, so slowly it seemed imagined, nodded. The woman felt tears prick her eyes. She didn't know why. Relief, maybe. Or the sheer weight of understanding what had just happened. "I guess you really did take something from me," she whispered. But it wasn't food. As if in answer, the bear turned and disappeared into the snow-laced forest, her cubs close behind her. The woman stood at the doorway for a long time, watching until they vanished among the pines. She didn't wave. She didn't cry. She simply stood there, quiet, still, profoundly changed. Morning came slow and quiet, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. Light filtered through the frosted windows of the cabin, soft and golden. The fire had burned low, leaving only glowing coals, but warmth still clung to the room. Martha stirred awake on the chair beside the cub, her hand still gently resting atop its thin fur. The little one breathed more steadily now, not entirely healed, but no longer drifting toward the edge of life. Beside it, tucked close for warmth, was the mother bear, who had come inside sometime during the night. She'd made no sound, issued no growl, only curled her large body around the cub like a blanket spun from instinct and love. Martha had not stirred when it happened, nor had she needed to. Now, in the thin quiet of the new day, the bear lifted her head. Her dark eyes met Martha's, and in that still, breathless moment, something passed between them again, older than language, older even than fear. A sort of reverence. Martha nodded faintly, and the bear, in turn, blinked once before lowering her head back to her cub's side. When the cub was strong enough to stand on its own feet, the bears left. It was nearly 2 weeks later. They didn't just disappear in the night. The mother came to the door, standing tall but not threatening, waiting until Martha stepped out and saw them. The cub, now steadier, still limped but no longer whimpered. The mother nudged it forward, gently urging it toward the woods. Martha watched them go, standing in her coat and scarf, the cold wind brushing her hair across her face. She didn't wave. She just watched, holding a cup of tea close to her chest as the snow crunched under their paws. They paused once at the tree lean. The mother looked back. Martha thought, for the briefest moment, that she might come back again, not for food, not for rescue, but for something else entirely. Then they vanished into the trees. Spring came and went. Summer bloomed over the mountains, and the world softened. Martha lived her life simply, with the door often left open, the kettle always warm, and the memory of the cubs breathing against her palm etched into her bones. But it was not the end. On the first cold night of fall, when the wind began to speak in the voices of frost and the trees rattled like old bones, something returned. Not the bear. Not yet. Instead, Martha found an object left at her door, something unmistakably chosen, unmistakably left behind. It was a bundle of pine boughs, tied with a twist of bark string. Embedded carefully within the bundle was a cluster of blackberries, out of season, too ripe for the weather, and a smooth river stone painted with the faint, childlike image of a woman holding a cub. It hadn't come from any human hand. And though Martha never spoke of it, never displayed the stone or told the local ranger who visited twice a year, she kept it inside, nestled among her most personal things. Sometimes, when the firelight flickered just right, she'd pull it out and hold it, as if she were holding a part of a story that had never really belonged to her in the first place, just borrowed, cradled, and protected for a time. The thaw that came in early April was slow but definite. What had been silent white became slush, and then turned to the black soil of awakening earth. Streams broke free from under their icy lids and began to babble again, telling stories to the trees. And one morning, the porch steps of the old cabin stood bare for the first time in months. The snow was gone, but the marks remained. The claw prints, still faintly preserved in the muddied path. A larger set, and 2 smaller ones. One pair left, never to return. The other lingered. Martha wasn't there to see it. Not in body. But in spirit, she was everywhere, in the wind chimes she'd strung by the eaves that now rang again, in the thrum of early bees around her cracked flower pots, In the neat firewood stack still perfectly arranged though no hands had touched it in weeks. The neighbor's son, Tom, was the first to come up after the snow cleared. He was a quiet boy, maybe 16. His father had asked him to check on the property and collect any letters or leftover supplies. He hadn't expected much. Maybe a shutter knocked loose. Maybe silence. What he didn't expect was the rock on the porch. It was flat, roughly the size of a dinner plate, and painted with care, though clearly by someone with thick fingers or large paws. A blue swirl, not quite a flower. A paw print sealed in mud. And beside it, nestled in a twist of dried blackberry vines, a feather. Owl, maybe. But soft. Intentional. He took it home and showed his father, who shrugged and said maybe Martha left it before she passed. But Tom knew better. The prints in the dirt hadn't been there long. The vines were fresh. And the rock was warm in his hand, as if it had been placed not more than an hour ago. He didn't tell anyone, but he returned 2 days later with a mason jar of honey. He left it on the stump by the fence line, right where the old man, before he passed, used to leave the yearly offering. He didn't wait. Didn't need to see what happened next. But when he came back a week later, the jar was empty. Licked clean. The bears, it seemed, remembered. The seasons turned. And though Martha's absence was felt, in the hollow echo of the cabin walls and the way the rocking chair no longer creaked at dusk, her presence remained in quieter ways. Birds still nested under the eaves. Bees returned to the cracked pots. And the bear, now older, visited each spring. She never came too close. Not like she had with Martha. But she came. And every year, she left something on the porch. Sometimes a bone-polished stick. Once, a deer antler. Another year, just a patch of moss and feathers tied together with sinew. Offerings, perhaps. Or just echoes of connection. But she came. And in the silence of the forest, something sacred lingered. The following day, the forest was loud with spring, sap rising in the bark, birds returning to the canopy, water rushing down thawed channels. But inside the cabin, silence had folded itself like a blanket over everything. Etta sat at the old table, tea gone cold in her mug, her notebook open but untouched. For the first time in years, she didn't know what to write. The bear had taken something that she couldn't define, couldn't reclaim, and couldn't stop thinking about. A ribbon of absence wound itself through the walls. And though she never said it aloud, the hollow she felt wasn't just about the memory book, it was about what that bear might have needed it for. Then came the knock. Or rather, the tap. Something gentle but persistent. Etta turned, slow with age and uncertainty. The window showed no visitors. But the door creaked open anyway, just a touch. A blue feather fluttered in, caught in a breeze that smelled like earth and pine needles. At her feet, laid carefully on the wooden floor, was a pine cone, painted with a pale swirl of the same blue that once marked the rock near the grove. Etta picked it up slowly, reverently, recognizing it not as a gift, but a message. That someone had seen her. Heard her. And perhaps remembered her too. The memory book did not return. But what followed was stranger still. Over the next few weeks, tokens began to appear. A white stone polished smooth and set inside her watering can. A small, crudely braided ring of grass placed on the threshold. Once, even an apple, frozen solid and clearly foraged out of some forgotten stash, sat on the windowsill as if left in offering. Etta began to write again, her stories now blending memories with the present. The characters that danced on her pages had paws and claws, feathers and fur, but they spoke, and more than that, they listened. She read her words aloud to the forest, voice crackling with age, but firm with truth. And sometimes, she'd catch a glimpse between the trees. A shadow. A familiar brown back. A nose twitching in the breeze. Not every evening. Not regularly. But enough. One dawn, the bear returned. She was older now, gray in places, thinner too. One of the cubs from before now loomed tall behind her, adolescent and unsure. But the matriarch stood still, silent, waiting. Etta, her cane firm in one hand, stepped off the porch and approached. She did not speak. The forest did not move. The bear lowered her head. In her mouth was something wrapped in bark and tied with a thin red thread. The thread Etta once used to bind the last page of the memory book. Her hands trembled as she took it. Inside the bark was not the full book, nor even a page. It was a leaf, pressed, dry, and familiar. A pressed maple leaf, the kind she'd pasted long ago on the inside cover. Underneath it was a line, burnt into a thin sliver of wood. "You remembered me. I remember you." No signature. No paw print. Just the feeling. Tears came, uninvited and unashamed. Not because she got something back, but because the bear had understood something. Had chosen, in its wild and wordless way, to acknowledge her loss, and meet it with a gift. The bear didn't stay. She turned and disappeared into the forest's shoulder-high grass, her cub pausing for one last glance. Etta returned to the cabin, pressed the sliver of wood into her new notebook, and wrote. "Some things aren't lost. They simply walk the world differently now." The winter air grew heavier, and though her fire still burned inside the cabin, something had shifted. The bear had not returned, not for days now. Not at dawn, not at twilight. Where once she could count on the soft rustle of branches or a low huff outside her door, there was only stillness. Clara found herself watching the tree line longer each day, sitting in the worn rocking chair that once belonged to her mother, clutching the carved necklace the bear had taken and then left behind weeks ago. She had found it nestled atop the old birch stump beside the cabin, polished clean, glistening with dew, left like a gift. But now the silence ached. She went further into the forest each day, following no trail but memory, listening for the familiar signs. Tracks had grown sparse, the scent of her companion dispersed among snow and distance. She worried, not in the way one worries for a pet, but as one aches for something that became part of the soul and then vanishes. Then, one evening, just as the sky bled into deep violet and a faint mist rolled in from the river, Clara caught sight of something. Movement low between the trees. It wasn't the bear. Not the one she knew. It was a smaller figure, a cub. Alone. Clara froze. It stepped out slowly, ears low, eyes wide and unsure. No sound behind it. No massive shadow lumbering close. The cub looked around, uncertain, then saw her, and paused. She crouched low, speaking gently, not expecting to be understood but hoping her tone would ease its nerves. The cub tilted its head, then took 2 trembling steps forward before sitting, as if waiting. And then it hit her. The bear, her bear, wasn't coming back. Clara stayed with the cub long past dusk, watching stars emerge like frost across the heavens. She knew that wild creatures made choices, and sometimes they made sacrifices. Something had changed. Something had happened. She buried her face in her hands, not to cry, but to steady her breath. She wasn't alone, but what had been taken from her this time was not a necklace, or a trinket, or even food. The forest had taken the bear from her, and in return left her something small and frightened and unfamiliar. Something to care for. The next morning, Clara returned to the cabin with the cub in tow. And this time, when she opened the door, she did not wait for the sound of the bear outside. She looked to the cub, curled now beside the hearth, and understood the story wasn't over. Only changed. The last snow came late that year. It wasn't a storm, nor a whisper, just a soft surrender of the sky. Flakes drifted like time itself, unhurried and unannounced. Mira stood at the cabin door, her shawl wrapped tightly, watching the forest exhale white breath. Her hands trembled not from the cold but from the ache of what was now gone. What had left her heart just as quietly as it had entered it. The little bear never returned. Spring came, as it always did. Then summer. The glade bloomed once more, and the cabin, once again, stood alone. Mira spent the warmer months mending fences, tending to herbs, patching the roof. She still left berries and roots at the stump. Sometimes they were gone. Other times they remained untouched. She never looked for tracks anymore. She didn't want answers, not anymore. Only a thread of hope to hold on to, as fine and thin as spider silk. But one morning, as the world yawned into autumn, something did return. It was carved, smooth and worn by a creature who should not know tools. A piece of driftwood, left on her porch beside a pine cone. Mira picked it up slowly, hands shaking. It had been smoothed and shaped. Not a perfect likeness, but unmistakable, a bear, and beside it, a second figure. A woman. Not precise. Not art. Just memory, passed from paw to wood. A silent thank you, maybe. Or a farewell. Or both. Mira sat on the porch for a long time, the carving in her lap, her eyes refusing to blink. She wasn't sure how it was possible. But she didn't need proof. She never had. The world didn't ask her to believe in what was real, only in what was true. And this was true. She kept the carving on the mantel, beside the old lamp and her father's pipe. Visitors, few as they were, sometimes asked about it. She would simply smile and say, "That's an old story. One I'm still living." Years passed like leaves on a stream. Mira aged, as all things do. Her hair turned to ash, her knees grew stiff, her walks shorter. But every winter, even when the snow was deep and her steps were slow, she left something by the stump. Not just food, but something of herself. A knitted scrap. A pressed flower. A poem scrawled on bark. And sometimes, in the quiet before dawn, when the frost whispered across the glass, she would hear it. A soft step. A deep breath. The hush of a presence too large to be wind. And in those moments, she would close her eyes, place her hand over her heart, and whisper, "Thank you." Not for the food returned, nor the company. But for the knowing that what had been shared between them, between woman and bear, did not need to be seen to still be alive. It just needed to be remembered.